promise not to give too long and flowery introduction, in part because it's impossible to properly introduce such an illustrious speaker. Professor Peter Fritszche, Professor of History at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, is perhaps one of the most eminent professors of modern German history in the United States today. He's written, by my count, at least 10 books, including a book I assigned to my class often, Life and Death in the Third Reich, a book on German imagination of the airplane, A Nation of Flyers, and a book that I read in my first year in graduate school, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring him for this commemoration, Reading Berlin in 1900, which isn't directly about the Berlin Wall, but is one of the most fascinating books that I've ever read about the city of Berlin. In addition, he's published more than 50 articles and chapters in peer-reviewed venues. And please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Fritszche to BYU.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Stan, and for all your help, Stuart. And it's been a real pleasure to be here. And I hope to talk a little more informally with you at the end about the in Q&A. Okay. 1989 was instantly recognizable as an eventful event, one that merited inclusion in global dating systems. It was connected to 1945 to periodize the Cold War, to 1917 to mark off the era of communism, and to 1914 to frame the short 20th century characterized by world wars, the Bolshevik Revolution, and their aftermath. In contrast to the long 19th century from 1789 to 1914. Its usefulness as a date to establish periods indicates the continuing relevance of dating systems and of periodization. It confirms the historical nature of the deeply embedded structures that seemed so permanently to shape post-World War II history, that is, the entire Cold War and the communist state system. The fall of the Berlin Wall on Germany's 9/11, that's to say November the 9th, a date shared with Germany's November Revolution in 1918, Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923, and Kristallnacht in 1938, all occurring on 9/11. This 9/11 marked the end of the Soviet Empire and the division of Europe. Indeed, the almost instantaneous recognition of 1989 in a spectacle of periodization as the end of an era and the beginning of a new one contributed decisively to the acceleration and thoroughness of the political landslide that year. In its lengthening shadow from the initial roundtable agreement on elections in Poland in February 1989 to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November and the execution of the Romanian leader on Christmas Day, communism seemed increasingly anachronistic and obsolescent, even to the statesmen themselves. Gorbachev himself had warned the East German leader Honecker about being left behind, urging him to reconcile himself with his times. So 1989 verified our own dating systems, 1789, 1914, 1945, which are all premised on and thus promise rupture and discontinuity. But the instant of recognition about endings left unclear what 1989 meant in the broader historical context and why it came about and what it meant when it did come about. We have tidy historical periods, with 1989 anchoring the end of the 20th century. But how But how has 1989 changed the way we think of history and of the other dates with which it is connected? 1945, 1914, 1789. 1989 came with terrific speed. Only 9 months separated the fall of the wall in November from the beginning of the discussions in Poland in February. And the pace of events produced two opposite effects. The daisy chain of revolutions came completely unexpected. They were not chaperoned by journalistic or academic predictions. And it is worth wondering what this unexpectedness really means. That 1989 coincided with the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, with Timothy Garton Ash stalking the pre-revolutionary 18th century footfalls of his fellow Englishman, Arthur Young, provided a further reminder about the basic frailty of seemingly permanent systems. In this case, the Bourbon monarchy and the Soviet Union. 89 recalls the historicity, that is the basically artificial nature of all social and political constructions. 1989 restored the role of surprise and underscored the role of contingency, just as had 1789. You know, I began teaching in 1987, and my early lecture notes underscored the stability and permanence of the Cold War in a kind of rhetorical fortification of both global division and global détente. And indeed, really, the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961, primarily the reason was to staunch the flow of East German refugees from East to West Berlin, and their numbers exceeded 2,000 a day that summer. The construction of the wall finally confirmed the division of Germany, of Berlin, and of Europe, a division recognized now and that would not be tampered with by the geopolitical players. And thus it was foundational to European stability and peace. It precluded any further efforts of poaching onto West Berlin territory. West Berlin would now remain West Berlin. The second effect of the speed of events was the retrospective illusion of their inevitability, as something seemed to fall into more agreeable, as everything seemed to fall into more agreeable place as one revolution spilled over to another, from Poland to Hungary to East Germany to Czechoslovakia to Romania. The fact that the foundations of the Cold War have almost completely disappeared, with few vigorous memories of the logic of détente, of mutually assured deterrence, of the hair-trigger defense and missile systems, of the geopolitical division of the globe, and the global movements that determined lines of trade, directions of research, airline routings, systems of weapons, and finally, simply the fear of nuclear annihilation makes the whole existence of the Cold War before 1989 surreal. It's really hard to imagine today you answering the question that I asked my students in Western Civ back in 1987. I said, do you believe you're going to die a natural death? And half said no. All this has just vanished. So this is a picture of the division of the city through the nighttime lighting. So east-west. And so much fun to play this up. But it just stands as a metaphor. It stands as a miniature for the division of Germany and the division of Europe. And there's the wall. The west is to the right. and therefore its citizens can come and go to the wall and spray paint it. And but the East German territory actually extends slightly about 2 feet further to the right, and only then is the division, where the curb is really the end, is the division between East and West Berlin. On the other side of the wall, you see the access road to the left of the first wall. Then you see the death zone, the green, with automatic tripwire machine gunning. Then there's a minefield, and then there is the second wall. And then come the apartments in Berlin, and these by the wall would have been inhabited then by party loyalists. So this is what came down, quite a feat to smash all that. 1989 is also an epistemological puzzle of sorts. Why did it happen? The European revolutions and the dissolution of the Soviet Empire occurred without external pressure or war. So it shredded many of the power political assumptions of the realist school of international politics, which assumed that only huge amounts of external pressure is going to change the distribution of power. At the same time, the pressure from below was actually pretty modest, although it was blown up through media coverage. The number of protesters in Leipzig in October could be counted in the thousands and then tens of thousands, which is exactly why the East German regime thought that they could nip this in the bud by force. But it was no more. The number of petitioners for reform in Czechoslovakia, a few weeks later, numbered no more than 75,000. And indeed, really, most observers thought that a perfectly plausible resolution to the crisis in the fall of 1989 was for the authorities to regain control through a Tiananmen Square-style massacre, as had occurred successfully in June 1989 in Beijing. And this expectation was premised on the assumption that people power could be countermanded, that it was neither overwhelming nor inevitable, nor entirely legitimate. Moreover, the superpowers were curiously absent, so that events were pushed forward by small people in small places and small groups. The role of personality throughout this is really unclear. Gorbachev and Bush didn't do much at all in fall 1989. But what's the role of Gorbachev going to the UN in 1985 and revoking the Brezhnev Doctrine, which meant that the Soviet Union would not interfere in the domestic affairs of fellow Warsaw Pact nations? What's the impact of Reagan's 1987 speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall? What's the impact of the visit of John Paul II to Poland in 1980? These are matters of continuing controversy, but in any case, in fall '89, neither Gorbachev nor Bush were drivers of the events. In fact, at a certain point, the key players in the Politburos lost not so much nerve, but faith, a vague feeling of knowing that they were just simply out of step with history. It was a psycho-historical consciousness of being misplaced, which had enormous historical consequences. I want to explore three ways in which the revolutions of 1989 revised the historical imagination in the ensuing 30 years up to now. First, the speed of events suggests the inherent frailty of Soviet and East European communism, which, in retrospect, had never established enduring anchors in society. The collapse resulted in the exposure of what was taken to be real history and real society, rather than the superficial communist kind. And this developed into an argument for the hardness of culture. and cultural identity and cultural difference. And the key theoretical manifesto here is Samuel Huntington's 1993 Foreign Affairs article, The Clash of Civilizations. Second, the speed of events also fortified the suggestion that the fall of communism had been inevitable and that the superiority of the West and its technological and political and military machinery was a settled matter. In some versions of this view, 1989 returned Europe to the globalizing and liberalizing trajectory that it had been on already before 1914. And here was an argument for neoliberal versatility. The key manifesto for this line of thought of postponed but now resumed globalization might be Francis Fukuyama's widely misunderstood summer 1989 article in the National Interest, The End of History. Third, I'm going to, at the very end, mention the memory boom since 1989 and contrast it to the idea of the hardness of culture and the triumph of neoliberalism. The rapid domino-like collapse of the communist regime strengthened the argument that the whole political experiment of state socialism had been without adequate foundations and lacked durable legitimacy. It was a creature of World War II and the Red Army. Underneath the surface, a real history remained, one which was constituted by hidden but enduring national and religious identities. Throughout Eastern Europe, national and ethnic histories were resacralized in the years after 1989. Old martyrs were reburied. Debates from the 1920s and 30s revived. These national histories, whether Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, were designated as the true essential marker of identity, and they established connections to, pre-war cultural trajectories, which were sometimes imagined as reaching deep into prehistory, whereas communism, which was transnational, was regarded as a parenthetical or surface phenomena. The hardness of culture rested on endurance, not change, so that the dominant metaphors are spatial, bounded identities, deep essences, and the contrast to surface ideology. The emergence of Serbian or Croatian national identity out of Yugoslavia are characteristic cases. But a boom in national history, national memory, and ethnic identification flourished everywhere in Europe. Given 1989, the histories of Poland or Hungary in the 1920s and 30s suddenly looked more pertinent and more central to the future. Observers talked about recovery and return. The journalist Robert Kaplan established the paradigm with his book Balkan Ghosts, in which he insisted on the ancient and unchanging nature of ethnic identity and conflict in the Balkans. The hardness of culture and the difference of difference that Kaplan argued for in the Balkans, Samuel Huntington established for the globe. In his provocative article, The Clash of Civilizations, Huntington contended that the world was divided into very distinct and to some extent mutually antagonistic civilizations: Islam, East Asia, Africa, the West, for example. And these civilizations had existed for hundreds of years, but they had not found enduring political form until after the collapse of European imperialism after 1945 and the end of the Cold War in 1989. Despite industrialization, migration to the cities, despite a global network of trade and migration, civilizations provided the most enduring way of looking at the world. The world, for Huntington, remained rooted in Herodotus's histories, with Persia opposing Greece, Islam, Christianity, the East, the West. So speed in 1989 corresponded to new imaginaries about depth and surface. In the last 5 years, the hardness of culture has triumphed in populist movements that have renationalized political horizons and focused anti-immigrant sentiments. The Law and Order Party in Poland polices national history with the new laws on the Holocaust. Brexit revives the World War II idea of Britain alone. In Central and Eastern Europe, Christianity has merged with national identity. Acts of national defiance against the European Union have resulted in the reconstruction of figurative and literal walls. For example, the 700 miles of wall between Hungary and Serbia. So this is not just to keep Syrian migrants out of Hungary, it's also to keep the migrants from crossing Hungary to other places. So this is in the transit route between Serbia and Hungary, 700 miles. The stirring transformation of the East Germans' call in 1989 for popular sovereignty against the bureaucrats and the communist leaders up there. We are the people, transformed into a demand for German unity. We are one people. A remarkable and fundamental and salient change in October 1989. But it's been rolled back into the right-wing appeal for ethnic homogeneity. We are the people. So 25 years ago, later, Huntington's manifesto seems more relevant than ever. So wir sind das Volk. This is the original Declaration of Liberty and Sovereignty, and the audience is the Politburo. It's Egon Krenz and Erich Honecker in Berlin. But then wir sind ein Volk means Germany belongs together. And we're not going to reform East Germany, we're going to mush it together with West. But they've revived the first one, we are the people, with the campaign of the Alternative for Germany this past summer and fall, reviving the memories but transforming them of 1989, damals wie heute, now just as then, we are the people. The speedy collapse of communism also strengthened the hand for the argument that the failure of communism of the Soviet Union and the satellite states was inevitable and revealed the basic superiority of Western capitalism, technology, and liberalism, particularly in an age dominated by information technology. Moreover, the essence of European history was to be found in the pre-1914 historical itinerary that the post-1989 world would take up again, having finally resolved the failed alternative directions begun in the interwar period. Fascism, communism. The short 20th century from World War I through the Cold War looked increasingly aberrant and strange with its ideologies and civil wars. World War I itself had been folly with horrific and far-reaching and unnecessary consequences not imagined at the outset. Historians refer to the Ur-catastrophe of World War I, the final consequences of which in the form of communism had now finally been resolved. Because in the wake of World War I, European history had been derailed by the Bolshevik Revolution and the European War that followed. Hitler's wars of conquest provided the extraordinary foundation for the expansion of communism in Europe, but just for a single post-1945 generation. Now, finally, in 1989, history had healed itself, finally, as The Economist famously put it. And indeed, the history of Russia, the field is now renamed Russian, not Soviet studies, and especially 1917, and particularly the run-up to 1917, looks completely different from the vantage of 1989. Imperial Russia, the Romanov period, Tsar Nicholas II, is increasingly seen as a site of experimentation and possibility, rather than as a terrain of inevitable decay. One version of this thesis was provided by Francis Fukuyama, who argued, somewhat before the fact, that the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism left the liberal, democratic capitalism of the West without a universal ideological competitor. The West, or liberal capitalism that the West had refined, the West was the last man standing, had won. History as a dialectical struggle between opposing idea systems had now come to an end with the victory of capitalism and democracy. The conception had been Hegel's in 1806 when he commented on the seemingly inevitable victory of Napoleon and thus of the ideas of the French Revolution, but it all made much more sense in 1989. Now, Fukuyama did not argue that events or wars or economic crises or terrorist attacks would come to an end. What had come to an end was the imagination of something fundamentally different from liberal capitalism that could pose as a universal, and not local, universal challenge, an alternative to that liberal democratic order. What had come to an end in the end of history was the movement of history through a matrix of difference and dialectical opposition. The global integration of the capitalist free trade world is confirmed by the ongoing massive movement of rural peoples into cities and economic migrants into the developed nations. It's an unnatural division. People are supposed to and do move, and they did move before 1961. This is the natural, on the left is the natural growth in the last 30 years of Europe. You see that some countries have considerable population decline, but it's made up by immigrants from internally and externally, so that there's actually population growth in Central and Western Europe. This alone is the migration to Britain, which is what provoked Brexit, from Eastern Europe in just the years after 2013, on a total of 800,000 from Poland. It's this internal European migration that provoked Brexit, not Muslim refugees or immigrants from Pakistan or anything like that. And these are the composite population flows across Europe in just 1 year, and also immigration to Canada and the US. We have to remember that the Brandenburg Gate is not a wall, it's really a bridge between Charlottenburg and Berlin that people strolled through and buses went through before the wall in 1961. Indeed, the timing of the construction of the wall on early morning Sunday, August 13, 1961, the timing was chosen so that they wouldn't trap movie-going East Berliners in West Berlin. They figured Sunday morning is the time when there'll be the least number of East Berliners in West Berlin. And West Berliners, after all, shopped in East Berlin. East Berliners worked in West Berlin, and the kids went to the movies. But 2 a.m. on a Sunday, the people are generally going to be back home. So it's an acknowledgement. The timing is an acknowledgement that Berliners move around. And since 1889, that circulation has resumed. And it's expanded to across Europe and beyond. Globalized identities are also strengthened by 21st century challenges, such as, well, you could say the war on terror, it's called the global war on terror, or climate change, global climate change, and global climate change agreements, which presume international cooperation to an unprecedented degree. To manage the plague in the early modern period, the sovereign city was not enough. You needed a nation to manage that problem. And with climate change, it might well be that the nation is not enough as an entity. You're going to need transnational entities to manage those problems and come up with some kinds of solutions. Fukuyama's The End of History is almost the opposite of Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. In The End of History, culture is soft enough to assimilate new technological, economic, and political forms which are highly portable across global borders. As productivity increases, state actors around the world begin to look more alike as they work under similar globalized conditions and deploy the same kind of technocratic and economic tools. In The Clash of Civilizations, by contrast, culture is hard enough to resist the leveling effects of global flows, establishing the ultimate difference of difference, which has a much longer track record than does assimilation, in the view of Huntington, so that Persia and Greece always remain. Both arguments revolve around how contemporaries evaluate the status of difference and the hardness of culture. And both theses seem to be plausible, given the way that contemporaries cluster around them. In Germany today, and was confirmed in state elections just 2 weeks ago, we see political dynamics tugging in both directions, with voters moving in hard culture, border-conscious alternative for Germany, as well as to the more global Greens. Brexit is not so much a decision to leave as it is a manifestation of an endless tug of war between establishing and crossing boundaries. The conflict in former Yugoslavia 25 years ago, which stands in for a variety of ethnic conflicts in Europe, should make us respectful of arguments for the hardness of culture. Although the conflict was not endemic and not based in ancient feuds, as Kaplan thinks, more and more people did think of themselves as primarily Serb or Croat or Kosovar. And they mobilized memories on behalf of those identities and deliberately built up exclusive national cultures of commemoration to fortify those identities. This memory culture is maybe not ancient, but it simulates its durability. And the hardness of culture does affect how people think of themselves and to whom they belong. The resacralization of history after 1989 in Eastern Europe rested, however, not so much on prior sacred traditions as it did on the destruction of the multinational empires after 1918 and on the homogenization of the territories as a result of ethnic cleansing throughout Europe since the 1940s. 60 years of ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe. First of all, the Shoah, the destruction of Jewish communities, also the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe, the long tradition, the trading off of the Greeks and the Turk populations in the early 1920s. These years of ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe were both premised on and produced strong homogeneous national identities. The short 20th century, with its wars and revolutions, was thus crucial to creating the effect of much longer-term simulations of cultural hardness and historical durability. Moreover, the depth of all these cultural and historical divisions however old they might be, has not really been as vexing as one might have imagined in 1989. Of course, they were murderous in Yugoslavia. But if one reads reports on the unification of Europe in 1989, the line between the Europe that the European Union would construct and the Europe that would be left behind was always assumed. But the question was, where would it be drawn? And over the years, this line between the European Union and the rest of Europe was pushed further and further east. And now we've reached Ukraine. Oh, this is going backwards because it's upside down. Oh yeah, so this is just another picture of the unnaturalness of the wall. So on the lower left, on the sort of this southwest corner, you see the wall going up north and going then to the east, completely crossing over the established subway lines, with the result that you had these ghost stations in East Berlin. So the West German subway ran through these ghost stations without stopping. So you have the expansion of the EU after 1989, first to include so-called Mitteleuropa with Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia, but then expanding to include Eastern Europe with the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, and Bulgaria, and now we're even at Ukraine. The difference, so the prognostications of antagonistic national ethnic identity, say between Germany and Poland, or Poland and Ukraine, and the idea of an unmanageable Balkans that would not be swallowed by the rest of Europe, and that the big division of Europe would be between the haves and the have-nots, the ones with the euro and the ones without. This has not come really to pass. Of course, the question of the difference of difference remains salient and is even more relevant in the surge of political populism. The status of non-European Muslim immigrants in Europe is vexed, as is the status of religious fundamentalism more generally. National history in Poland and Hungary seems more pertinent to identity. 10 or 20 years ago, the hardness of culture did not seem as hard as it does today. So this is the estimated share of Muslims among the total population of 2016. So this is after the big intake of 2015. So Germany, England, Sweden, France having considerable proportions. And of course, those that are most frightened by it, Hungary and Poland having minuscule proportions. And then the debate. This is the marches in Dresden. This is the anti-further minaret campaign in Switzerland in 2009, decisively defeated, incidentally, but with minarets being looked as missiles and co-citizens made to look like terrorists. But what about the other big idea, that history has healed itself, that the European Civil War was an interlude, that the clash of ideologies, fascism versus communism, not so pertinent, that history has reconnected itself, has healed itself. In fact, the integration of nations in the long term, seen over 30 years, and the financial network across the globe has increased. Democratization over the long term has increased, whether you take 1989 as your benchmark, or 1945, or 1806. The idea that you could go it alone, as the Third Reich tried to do, or Stalin's Soviet Union tried to do, or Mao's China tried to do, or maybe the Brexiteers want to do, has not really worked. The big picture renders a kind of logic to Fukuyama's argument. And globalization might not be the desired goal, but it is an increasing reality in an age of unprecedented climate change and migration flows from north to south and east to west, more people are going to be on the road. 1989 also, so we have to debate the softness and the hardness of culture. And as we do so, we should keep in mind another debate or insight that 1989 provided. Suddenly, the certainties of the post-World War II era were called into question. The badness of the fascists and the goodness of the anti-fascists. The fall of communism was accompanied by a thinking through of one's own positionality during these 40 years of communism. People didn't experience communism as the long wait for 1989. They made accommodations with the future that they were given. And since no one assumed the wall was going to fall, of course you assumed that your future was going to be in East Germany or Communist Poland or Communist Czechoslovakia. And you somehow had to make do. Maybe you're going to reform the state. But your future was going to be in the state, and you were going to have to accommodate. You can call that collaboration, adjustment, accommodation, common sense. And after 1989, there was a sense of judging those positionalities, but not necessarily absolutely, but with sympathy, because one understood that 1989 was not on the menu, and that nobody could anticipate that. So people had a greater understanding for one's position in the gray zone, both as a collaborator and as an adjuster. And so the experience with communism gave people a greater sensitivity to people's old positions in the past before one knew that that past would become permanently past, but also a new sensitivity to those very same kinds of collaborations in the Third Reich, because it wasn't just about the bad German occupation authorities, but also collaborationist civilians in Western Europe. So this is the waves of democratization, and one can talk about new authoritarian movements in the last 5 years, but the long-term trend of moving away from pure dictatorships and closed authoritarian systems is extremely clear, and purple up there, down there is decolonization, people living unfree in colonies, all that's ended. So considerable democratization, or semi-democratization, in which even the Soviet Union under Putin is seen as good news compared to Soviet Union under Brezhnev. Well, I didn't talk about those sentences. So these are punks in East Germany before 1989. Maybe a little bit of a thorn in the side of the regime, but they also had to make their future, and were going to make their future, in this East German state. So these are Amsterdam Jews making their way to the local tram station, where they go to the Centralstation and on to Westerbork, guided and aided by tram drivers and the Dutch police. These are the French municipal buses. This is your local bus system that picks up the Jews in the Great Raffle of July 15, 16, 1949, to bring the captured Jews to the Ville d'Hiver on the outskirts of Paris. And French policemen, you can identify them with their buttons here on their coats that will accompany, that manage them. So 1989 has encouraged us to take a closer look at historical situations, to see the gray zones, to make more nuanced and empathetic judgments that were not there in the absolutist Cold War years. History in the gray zone, then, to conclude, takes as its subjects the happenstance nature of identities and loyalties. It corresponds to the dispersion as well as the opportunities threats, and dangers of a post-Cold War era. It is perhaps the classic terrain of a risk society in which individuals are forced to do the work of a collective imaginaries and to be alert to the concealments and complicities of history, to take small steps forward. The pendulum has now swung to the hardness of culture, maybe, but the surprise and speed of 1989 serves as a constant reminder of the changingness of all things, the hard logic of Cold War, of realism, of culture, and of attitudes towards one another. Borders, refugees, climates. Is Fukuyama our travel guide, or is Huntington? We have to remember that 1989 was one of the biggest events of our time that was not predicted. The Berlin Wall, up one night, down in another. Thank you. So I lingered here a little longer than I intended, but I'm happy to do. I know you guys have to leave, but some of you, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, please just ask at the microphone. So this is being recorded. We'll get both your question and Professor Fritzsche's answer. And just tell us your name, what you're studying if you're a student, and we'll go as long as there are questions. So please.
Neil Millman. I happened to be in Berlin in November 30 years ago.
You.
And also December 31st for the reunification at the Brandenburg Gate. And so I observed an incident that happened that I haven't seen recorded or make much incident, but I thought something did happen that maybe could have been a pivotal event. And that was when, awaiting midnight, a young man got to the top of the Brandenburg Gate, took down the East German flag, and cut out the communist symbol, the sickle, and everybody was kind of hushed. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And fortunately, nobody shot him. He cut out the symbol and put the flag back up. So he was really provoking. I think I saw it, and I think other people saw it as provocation against Russia, that we want Russia out of our lives permanently. But anyway, could an incident like this have been could it have incited violence? I want to know, maybe you have the insight, did Russia have an army massed ready to come in at a moment's notice if something went awry? Could it have been like a Dr. Strange-Lovian outcome instead of what actually happened?
The Russian army was based in barracks in East Germany, but it wasn't ready to do anything. It was standing down. But of course, that was the threat. But Gorbachev had anticipated this. And he said that we are not going to intervene. And if people want to leave the Warsaw Pact, they can. What they can't do, and this is Putin's traumatic event, because he's in the KGB in Dresden at the time, they can't go invade KGB headquarters and go rifle through the files. And that was Putin's, Putin made sure they didn't do that. The discussion of the use of force had been discussed over 3 weeks in East Germany. So people talked about whether the time had come, and this I think was October the 11th, to use force to disperse the crowds in Leipzig and in Dresden. And the consensus was no. Both the Stasi and our I call them moderates, but a diverse group of East German functionaries said no. So the Tiananmen Square model had been worked through. The use of East German soldiers and police had been worked through to such a degree that the border guards were now psychologically disarmed. But nonetheless, you're right. It's a symbolically dangerous moment. It could have been taken that there are revanchist, fascist, nationalist forces, like what Russia says about the Ukrainian revolution of 2014. And there were concerns at the time about that kind of neo-nationalism, and were shared by Thatcher, for example, who, in Great Britain, who had to be convinced to go along with German unification. But by then, the rhetoric had gone from "we are the people" to "we are one people." And that was the end of East Germany, which had no identity except its communist identity. Poland's going to be Poland, whether it's communist or not. East Germany can only be communist. So in many ways, cutting out the hammer and sickle was simply a recognition of that basic fact. The only paradox is the initial reformers who had organized the big demonstrations in Leipzig did not want an end to the DDR. They wanted a reform. They wanted a third way. They wanted independence. And you know how many votes they got in the free elections of March 18th, 1990? Basically. So that was just not an option. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned some specific challenges that East Germany may face in its immigration issues.
East Germany or East Europe?
East Germany. My question is, what are some specific solutions that East Germany could look into integrating their immigrants?
Well, first I have to say that America let in 800,000 people in 2015. That's like letting in 5 million in the United States. And if she had let in 5 million people into Germany in November 2015, we would have said that would have been too many, right? 5 million is too many. So it is, in the end, a numbers game. And if it's a numbers game, then you have to understand those people who are not for 800,000. You have to have a degree of understanding of why this is threatening, and you need to acknowledge that, I believe. The West and East German population are losing people. West Germany without immigrants is shrinking. It is not reproducing at the replacement rate of 2.1. Educated Germans have already left East Germany for West Germany. So this is a deindustrialized, much more underdeveloped place today than it was 30 years ago. And that is the opportunity for the new immigrants. And instead of closing down schools, you can reopen them. These small towns can be revived. The problem is language and culture, and no one should underestimate that. But I don't think it's insurmountable. And if you go look at actual towns where actual people meet each other, then the problems seem more easily solved than in places where people have preconceptions and images like we saw on the Swiss election placards. So face-to-face relations help. But I think also help is to acknowledge why people have these fears. I had relatives in East Germany, and the first thing they said to me when I saw them after the fall of the wall was, what is this about multiculturalism? You know? And I said, get on board, dude. But that's, maybe I should have said it more gently. When I go to Berlin, I don't see 800,000 people. I don't see it visually. So I think it is doable, and these Germans have the populist base is older, less educated, less apt to move. The people who are educated, younger, and more apt to move have already done so. And that is the big difference with the populist electorate of 2016, whether we're talking about the Alternative for Germany or we're talking about Trump. Then we're talking about the fascist electorate of the 1930s, which was disproportionately educated and young and looking at a new future rather than defensive about an old past. So these are, and if you understand that, this is you have to understand what people's fears are. But if you're going to revive these communities and rebuild a kind of integrated local economy in many of these depressed East German places, this might be the way to do it. It's not going to help rural Poland because I don't think Poland's going to let in these refugees. And it's just going to have to be a change of discourse. The previous parties in Poland did not police their history. And so there was much more openness to Poland's diverse, multi-ethnic past crimes and opportunities from back then, which included Germans, Ukrainians, Jews, as well as Catholic Poles, than the policing of the law and order party. But I don't see a change of governments in Poland as now creating a new flow of refugees into Poland. But there'll be a new openness to strictly nationalized histories. But yeah, I think there are solutions in East Germany, but you also have to acknowledge their fears. As we do in America, incidentally.
Hi, so my name is Dalton Bradford, I'm a Middle East Studies major, and you...
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. So you mentioned earlier the impact of culture driving revolutions across Europe preceding the fall of the Berlin Wall. Would you say there's a similar comparison nowadays, and we're seeing a lot of revolutions across the world? There's no like exact link, but you see in Chile, you see in Lebanon, you see in Iraq, a lot of revolutions occurring. Do you think that there's a similar role of culture in fighting against trending ideologies nowadays, such as Trumpism, fascism, and ethno-nationalism?
Well, the little I know about this, well, I think economic inequality is driving this, but it's combined with the fact that there's the promise of economic opportunities. There was an article in the New York Times about Chile is people are going to college, but then there's no opportunities after that, or it's hard to get into graduate school. What I find interesting about the discourse that's happening in Iraq is that it's susceptible to anti-Iranian focus. So it's not obsessively Shia or Muqtada al-Sadr. It's also bridging a variety of Shia sects and the Sunnis in the name of a unified Iraq. And that undoes some of the mistrust that had accompanied the recent elections in 2015 and 2010. And Lebanon is also apparently against this constant religious and ethnic segmentation. But I think the fact that you don't have garbage service in Beirut is probably very, very crucial. Banks have been closed for 3 weeks now in Beirut, so some of it is these other things. The outcome of some of the Arab Spring, the ethnic cleansing is a strong trend, and a lot of the problems in Iraq were because the Shiites were now finally going to get the power that had long been denied them. And the Sunnis weren't even sure that they were only 35% of the population in 2003. And so there's a lot of sort of surprise and sorting things out. And ethnic homogenization, sadly, is the basis for a lot of national identity or ethnic identity and sovereignty. Ditto Syria. This is a Sunni majority population, basically ruled by a Shiite minority government. And that has fueled a lot of the tensions in Syria. So those cultural markers are indeed very important. Unfortunately, the Arab Spring was accompanied by anti-Cop violence. So this reassertion of national identity, these would confirm sort of the Huntington side of things. But I don't know, all of this is in the retrospect after 89. How people thought in 89, I'm not sure. Whether they thought that they were more walking with the Fukuyama guidebooks and we want consumer goods and want to travel, or Huntington guidebooks, which is that we want the true Poland and the communists are by definition illegitimate. But that's the big question. That's the big historiographical question. And once you answer that, then you will fit in how important was the Pope's visit to Krakow in 1980. How important was Reagan's tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev? How important was IT? You saw the Sputnik side that I didn't show. In the 1950s, most economists, you read the Paul Samuelson's big economics textbook from that time, They thought that the Second World was a perfectly plausible economic system, and possibly even superior if you think about the fact, we don't often know this, not only the first satellite in space, but through Sputnik, but sorry, John Glenn, the first human being to orbit the Earth, Yuri Gagarin. So people wondered about the superiority of the East. So the idea that the technological gap between East and West was always there is perhaps not so. But certainly began to yawn when everyone started having portable. I mean, laptops came out I had my first laptop in 1986. So there was nothing like this in East Germany, much less a Xerox machine available. It was a different place, and people waited for their cars. Most people didn't have cars. There was a long list for cars. And do you know what? There were those East Germans that received their car, their Trabi, on November 9th. And they were very happy about that. And the champagne came out. And only at 10 o'clock at night was there a little bit of second thinking about putting all that money down on the Trabi. So, yeah. Well, yes, sir.
I've always felt that this period in history has been overlooked routinely because it's politically inconvenient for a lot of people on the left and active communists in Europe. And I just was wondering what the reaction has been to your, because I mean, I went to graduate school in Europe, and I'd say 75% of our speakers were communists, like Hammer and Sickle, Marxist quoting communist. And I even asked one of them, so what do you view as future communism? They're like global revolution. And 1989 is the counter-revolution being successful. So in contrast, how much is talked about the Vietnam War, when you think 1989 is way more significant than the Vietnam War, as far as like global impact.
Well, I'm a pretty left-wing chap.
Yeah.
But out of what hole did those speakers crawl from?
Communists make up 16% of academics.
No.
Well, I mean,
no,
in the social sciences
Marxists.
and Marxist. Okay, I'm sorry.
And no, communism has pretty much discredited itself. And the CPUSA is hardly a big thing. The East German reform movement comes partially out of reformers who wanted to be loyal to the state, but not in its present-day form. The big demonstrations on Alexanderplatz in Berlin on November 4th actually had people from the Politburo there, but wanted reform. But I think the big lesson is this is not certain. No one thought the Soviet Union was a model, and what the usefulness of the Soviet Union was, and this is quoting a pretty loyal communist, Eric Hobsbawm, was to remind capitalism that it had a public relations job to do, and that it wasn't perfect. And once communism falls, there's no alternative, and capitalism then can be self-complacent and self-congratulatory. But the East German and the East European communist leaders were, first of all, quite old, and second, didn't believe in themselves anymore. And that's why it fell so quickly. There is in Germany a successor to the Communist Party, which has been around since 1920, and is now called the Left, Die Linke. And their offices is the old CP headquarters in the middle of Berlin. But they are nothing like the SED, and they're nothing like the KPD of the old days. I personally wouldn't vote for them, but they're not the same old creature. So, no, I don't see that. And I think what's striking in 2008 is the narrow bandwidth of the economic discussions. It was whether do we apply Keynes or not. It's really what the discussions of 2009 amounted to. Do we impose austerity politics on Greece, or do we not? That's an extremely narrow bandwidth. So I don't see all this Marxism. In fact, the bigger question is what's left.
It's significant in Scotland and in Ireland. I mean,
Yes.
yeah,
but
I mean,
that's
very
half
significant.
nationalism, 3/4 nationalism.
yeah, well, hammer and sickle. I mean, to me, you're right. There's always the sliding trail of like, where's the line? But if someone is waving the hammer and sickle, that's a Soviet
But yeah,
reference.
sure. But you're
So,
against the present, but you're not for that.
yeah. Well, anyway. So you found that your research has been well received, that you don't find this a controversy, you don't get uncomfortableness
Oh, no, I don't
about
get-
the fall of
well, I mean-
communism with other
I don't
left-leaning
meet people who
academics.
think that the wall shouldn't have come down.
Yeah, well,
And
Putin does.
I meet people who disagree about the way forward.
Yeah.
I disagree with, there's disagreements about what Jeffrey Sachs was, emergency capitalist treatment in Poland in 1990, something that he has now disowned. I see disagreements about austerity politics and the destruction of the Greek economy. I see disagreements about, look, Europeans have the very things we're arguing against. There'd be riots in Europe if they lost what we think is impossible to get: public health care and subsidized, if not free, education. And those are the arguments.
Yeah. So, okay. So you don't find it any problem? I mean,
Well, I
mean,
certainly have
Yeah.
a side in the issue.
Yeah.
But it's surprisingly that it's rather not so ideological compared to the 1930s.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I take your point, but I think the word Scotland explains a lot.
Well,
And they'll have their chance. They're going to
well,
get
the director of-
independent.
the director of my school was German, though, and I really think he was a communist who invited them all. So, and I don't know if he's East German or West German. But.
Yeah, but then they go to Tuscany for their vacations, and they listen to their playlist.
They live off
I don't
American
have a cell
graduate
phone.
schools.
Am I a communist? But they all have their. Anyway, thank you for the questions. The hard questions.